The flickering neon sign of Pete's Gas and Go cast a sickly green glow across the deserted highway. Inside, Mark, a 20-year-old college student, slumped behind the counter, trying to focus on his sociology textbook. The silence of the night was thick, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional distant rumble of a truck on the interstate. This was his third night shift at the gas station, a place so isolated it felt like it existed in its own time zone, miles from the nearest town. He needed the money for tuition, and Pete, the owner, didn't ask too many questions about why he preferred the graveyard shift. Mark had quickly learned that remote was an understatement. The station was a small island of light in an ocean of darkness, surrounded by vast, empty fields. The only regular customers were tired truckers stopping for coffee and the occasional lost tourist. Tonight, however, had been exceptionally quiet, almost eerily so. He flipped a page, his eyes scanning the dense text, but his mind kept drifting. A soft thud from the back room made him jump. He looked up, peering towards the closed door that led to storage and the employee break area. Probably just the old building settling, he told himself, trying to ignore the prickle of unease that ran down his spine. The gas station was old, built sometime in the 70s, and it creaked and groaned like a tired ship. He'd heard similar noises before, but tonight they seemed different, more deliberate, less random. He tried to shake the feeling, blaming it on sleep deprivation and the oppressive quiet. He went back to his book, but a moment later, the fluorescent lights above him flickered violently, plunging the store into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. Mark frowned. The lights had flickered before, but never like that. It felt less like a power surge and more like a deliberate wink. He glanced around the empty store, a sudden chill raising goosebumps on his arms, despite the stuffy warmth inside. The aisles of snacks and drinks stood silent, reflecting the harsh light. No cars on the highway, no footsteps outside, just him and the silence. A faint scratching sound started from the back room, like fingernails dragging lightly across wood. Mark froze, his textbook forgotten. It wasn't the usual creaking. This was distinct, rhythmic almost. He held his breath, straining to hear over the hum of the refrigerators. The scratching stopped as suddenly as it began. He waited, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Nothing. He slowly exhaled, telling himself it was just rats. Old buildings had rats. It was logical, explainable. But the image of tiny claws dragging across wood didn't quite fit the sound he'd heard. He tried to distract himself by tidying the counter, wiping down the sticky surface, rearranging the candy bars. As he reached for a stack of lottery tickets, he felt it, a sudden, intense cold spot right next to him. It wasn't just a draft. It was like stepping into a freezer, a pocket of frigid air that enveloped his right side. He instinctively recoiled, his gaze snapping to the spot where he'd felt the chill. Nothing. Just empty air. The cold dissipated as quickly as it had appeared, leaving him shivering. He told himself it was the old air conditioning unit, maybe kicking on unexpectedly, but he knew that wasn't right. The AC hadn't worked properly in weeks. A shadow, darker than the general dimness of the back of the store, seemed to detach itself from the corner of his eye, moving quickly behind the rows of potato chips. He whirled around, his eyes darting to the spot. Empty. The chip bags hung still, undisturbed. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. "You're tired, Mark," he muttered to himself, his voice sounding thin and small in the vast quiet. "Just tired." But the feeling of being watched intensified. It was a pressure, a prickle on the back of his neck, making him want to look over his shoulder constantly. He felt like he was on a stage, and an unseen audience was scrutinizing his every move. He tried to focus on his phone, scrolling through social media, anything to break the spell of the unnerving quiet. Then a soft, almost imperceptible whisper drifted from the back room. It was too faint to make out words, but it was undeniably there, a breathy, sibilant sound that made his blood run cold. It wasn't a rat. It wasn't the building settling. It was something else. Something that shouldn't be there. He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to lock himself in the car, but he was trapped. He was on duty, alone, miles from anywhere. He swallowed hard, trying to rationalize it away. The wind, maybe. The old pipes. Anything but what his terrified mind was suggesting. But the whispers felt too close, too deliberate. He was not alone in Pete's Gas and Go. The thought sent a fresh wave of dread washing over him. The night was just beginning, and he knew, deep down, that something was terribly wrong. The soft, unsettling whispers from the back room didn't stop. They became a low, continuous murmur, like a radio tuned between stations. Mark tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the bright, artificial glow of the energy drink cooler. But the sound was a persistent itch at the back of his mind, growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't just in his head. He was sure of it. He risked a glance towards the closed door leading to the storage area. It seemed darker than usual, a deep, consuming blackness that swallowed the faint light from the main store. The air around him suddenly felt heavy, thick, as if something unseen was pressing in. Then, a box of instant noodles sitting innocently on a shelf near the counter slid slowly forward, teetering on the edge before dropping to the floor with a soft thud. Mark jumped, a strangled cry catching in his throat. His eyes were wide, fixed on the fallen box. He hadn't touched it. No one had. He was alone. The rational part of his brain, the part that had confidently dismissed rats and faulty AC units, was now screaming. This wasn't normal. This wasn't explainable. He bent down, his hands trembling slightly, to pick up the box. As his fingers brushed against the cardboard, he felt that same intense cold spot again, not localized this time, but spreading from the shelf, down to the floor, enveloping his hand in an icy embrace. He snatched his hand back, rubbing it vigorously against his jeans, trying to warm it. The cold lingered, a phantom chill that sank deep into his bones. He stood up straight, his gaze sweeping the empty store. Every shadow seemed to stretch and twist, taking on menacing shapes. The mundane racks of snacks and rows of motor oil now looked like silent, watchful sentinels. He swore he saw a flicker of movement behind the display of car air fresheners, a fleeting ripple in the stagnant air. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them again, forcing himself to breathe deeply. "It's nothing," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Just shadows, just tired." But the conviction was gone. A car pulled up to pump number 3. Mark's heart leaped with a mix of relief and dread. A customer. Finally. He watched as a tall, thin figure emerged from the driver's side. The person was dressed in dark, almost shapeless clothes and wore a wide-brimmed hat that obscured their face. They moved slowly, deliberately, to the pump. Mark waited, expecting them to come inside to pay, or at least make eye contact. But they didn't. They just stood there, completely still, their back to the store, as the pump clicked away. The silence from the customer was unnerving. Most people at this hour were either chatty or in a hurry. This person was neither. After what felt like an eternity, the pump clicked off. The figure slowly replaced the nozzle, then just stood there, unmoving, for another long moment. Mark watched, his hand hovering over the cash register. He felt a strange compulsion to look closer, to see their face, but also a profound fear of what he might see. He waited for them to turn, to walk towards the entrance. They didn't. Instead, the figure simply got back into the car, slowly, deliberately, and drove away without paying. No lights, no brake lights. Just a silent, dark car vanishing into the night. Mark stared at the empty spot where the car had been, his mouth slightly open. He walked out to the pump, checking the meter. It showed a transaction, a full tank of gas. But the register hadn't dinged. No payment had been made. He felt a wave of profound unease wash over him. It wasn't a drive-off. It was something else. The figure hadn't been in a hurry, hadn't sped away. They had just left. Like a ghost. He looked around the empty forecourt, the highway stretching into endless darkness. There was no sign of the car. It was as if it had never been there at all. Back inside, the quiet felt heavier, more oppressive. The murmuring from the back room had stopped, replaced by a new sound. A soft, rhythmic scratching, like something dragging its nails across wood again, but this time it was coming from inside, the main store. Mark whipped his head around, trying to pinpoint the source. It seemed to be coming from the aisle with the car parts, near the old tire display. He took a hesitant step, then another, towards the sound. Each scratch was deliberate, slow, drawing him in. As he got closer, the air grew noticeably colder, a biting chill that made his breath plume in front of him. He could feel goosebumps rising on his arms, despite the warmth of his uniform shirt. He reached the end of the aisle, peering around the stacks of oil filters. Nothing, but the scratching was now right beside him, seemingly coming from the floor. He looked down, his eyes scanning the dusty concrete, and then he felt it. A light, almost playful brush against his ankle, then his calf. It felt like cold, skeletal fingers tracing his skin through his jeans. He gasped, stumbling backward, tripping over his own feet and landing hard on the tiled floor. He scrambled away, crab-walking backwards, his eyes wide with terror. He could still feel the phantom touch, a lingering iciness on his leg. He pressed himself against the counter, breathing hard, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't his imagination. This wasn't fatigue. This was real. The faint, almost imperceptible whispers started again, but this time they were clearer, closer. They weren't just sounds. They were distorted, garbled words, just at the edge of his understanding. He strained to hear, to make sense of the jumbled syllables, but they dissolved into static before he could grasp them. Then, a loud, jarring bang echoed from the back room. Not the scratching, not the whispers, but a solid, heavy thud. It sounded like something had been thrown against the far wall. Mark flinched, his eyes fixed on the back room door. It was still closed, but now, a sliver of light, a cold, pale yellow, was visible beneath it. He knew for a fact that the light in the back room was always off. He had checked it himself before his shift. And the door, a heavy metal fire door, was always kept locked from the inside. Always. As he watched, frozen in place, the door slowly, agonizingly, began to creak open. Just a crack at first, revealing more of that sickly yellow light. Then wider, inch by agonizing inch, until it was ajar, a dark, gaping maw leading into the unknown. From within, the whispers started again, louder now, accompanied by a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the very floor beneath his feet. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. Mark could feel his blood run cold, his muscles tense, ready to bolt. The night had only just begun, and the gas station was no longer just isolated. It was actively, terrifyingly haunted. The low, guttural moan from the back room was enough. Mark didn't need to see it. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to get out, to escape the suffocating terror that had taken over the gas station. He pushed himself off the counter, his legs shaky, but he forced them into motion. He ran towards the front door, fumbling with the lock with trembling hands. The cold, metallic click felt like a gunshot in the oppressive silence that had suddenly fallen. The moaning had stopped. The whispers had vanished. All that remained was the sound of his own ragged breathing and the frantic beat of his heart. He yanked the door open, the bell above it jingling mockingly. A sound usually signaling a customer, but now just an announcement of his desperate flight. He burst out into the cool night air, sucking in huge gulps of oxygen as if he had been underwater. He didn't look back. He just ran. His old beat-up car was parked just a few feet away, a beacon of hope in the darkness. He scrambled inside, his fingers slipping on the cold metal of the door handle. He jammed the key into the ignition, turning it with a prayer. The engine sputtered once, then caught, roaring to life. He didn't even bother to put it in reverse. He threw it into drive and peeled out of the parking lot, gravel spitting from beneath his tires. He glanced in his rearview mirror, a quick, terrified peek at the gas station bathed in the pale glow of its own lights. And that's when he saw it. Standing in the doorway where he had just been was a figure. It wasn't human, not even close. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, too spindly. Its head was a dark, featureless oval, tilted slightly as if observing him. He couldn't make out any eyes, but he felt its gaze, a cold, piercing intensity that went straight through him. A wave of pure, unadulterated horror washed over him, making his hands clench the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, the car lurching forward, picking up speed down the deserted highway. He didn't stop driving until the gas station was a tiny, distant speck in his mirror. And even then, he kept going, not daring to slow down, not daring to look back again. He drove until the sun began to paint the sky with streaks of orange and pink until the terror slowly receded, replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. He never went back to that gas station. Not for his paycheck, not for his belongings, not for anything. He called his boss from a payphone in the next town, his voice shaking as he mumbled something about a family emergency. He knew his boss didn't believe him, but he didn't care. Nothing was worth going back there. He quit on the spot, severing all ties with the place that had almost claimed his sanity. The experience left an indelible mark on him. Sleep became a luxury, plagued by nightmares of long, spindly limbs and featureless faces. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat. Every creak of the floorboards sent shivers down his spine. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in broad daylight, surrounded by people. The world, once a predictable, rational place, had been irrevocably altered. He had always been a skeptic, someone who scoffed at ghost stories and supernatural claims. Now he was a believer, but it was a belief born of terror, not curiosity. He tried to talk about it once, to a close friend, but the words faltered on his tongue. How could he explain what he had seen, what he had felt, without sounding completely insane? His friend listened patiently, but the pity in their eyes was clear. Mark knew then that he would have to carry this burden alone. He changed his major, opting for something that kept him far away from isolated places and night shifts. He sought solace in crowded spaces, in the comforting anonymity of a busy city, but even there, the memories would creep in, unbidden. The gas station, once just a job, had become a scar on his soul. It had shown him a glimpse of something beyond human comprehension, something ancient and malevolent that lurked just beneath the surface of the mundane. He learned to live with the fear, to push it down, but it was always there, a cold knot in his stomach, a reminder of the night he almost didn't make it out. He would always remember the feeling of those cold, skeletal fingers on his leg, the guttural moan, and the impossibly tall figure in the doorway. It was a silent trauma, a secret he carried, knowing that some experiences are too terrifying, too unbelievable to ever truly share. The gas station was gone, but the horror it instilled in him remained, a permanent resident in the landscape of his mind. He was a survivor, but the price of his survival was a fractured peace, a constant awareness of the thin veil between his world and something else, something terrifyingly real. The chilling story of the gas station was just one of many whispered tales among those who worked the graveyard shifts. Hospitals, with their quiet hallways and unseen suffering, often bred their own unique brand of unease. This brings us to Sarah, a nurse who had seen it all. She was a woman in her late 40s, with kind eyes that had witnessed too much pain and a no-nonsense attitude born from years of dealing with life and death situations. Sarah had been a nurse for over 2 decades, working in bustling emergency rooms and calm pediatric wards. She considered herself pragmatic, a realist. Ghosts and ghouls were for movies, not for serious medical professionals. She scoffed at superstitions and relied on logic and evidence. One particularly understaffed month, Sarah was assigned to an old, rarely used wing of the city hospital. It was known as the West Wing, a relic from a different era of medicine, mostly housing storage and a few administrative offices now. The wing was scheduled for demolition in a few years, making way for a new, modern facility. For now, it served as overflow for patients when the main hospital was exceptionally full, or sometimes for those with very specific long-term needs that required isolation. Her colleagues, younger nurses mostly, spoke in hushed tones about the West Wing. They exchanged knowing glances when her assignment was announced. "Good luck with that, Sarah," one of them had said, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Heard it gets a bit lively at night in there." Sarah had simply rolled her eyes, attributing their stories to an overactive imagination fueled by too much caffeine and late-night exhaustion. She'd heard all the old hospital rumors before: phantom patients, crying babies in empty rooms, the ghost of a surgeon who couldn't let go. None of it ever fazed her. Her first few shifts in the West Wing were uneventful, exactly as she expected. The air was thick with the scent of old dust and disinfectant, a smell that clung to everything. The hallways were long and dimly lit, the fluorescent tubes humming with a tired, sputtering sound. Most nights, she was the only one assigned to the wing, responsible for checking on the handful of long-term patients who resided there. These patients were mostly elderly, often sedated, and rarely required much attention beyond routine checks. The quiet was profound, broken only by the rhythmic beep of a monitor or the gentle rustle of her scrubs as she walked. This initial quietude lulled her into a false sense of security. She spent her time catching up on paperwork, reading medical journals, and sometimes just enjoying the rare peace of a truly silent night shift. She even started to think the West Wing wasn't so bad after all. It was a nice change from the usual chaos of the main hospital. Then the first subtle signs of activity began. It started with faint sounds, almost imperceptible at first. A soft click from an empty room, the distant scrape of a chair across a tiled floor when she knew no one was there. She dismissed them as the building settling, old pipes groaning, or perhaps just the wind playing tricks outside the aging windows. One night, a distinct, almost human cry seemed to echo from the far end of the corridor, a sound like a child in distress. Sarah froze, her heart giving a little jump. She immediately went to investigate, checking every room, every storage closet, but found nothing. The patients were all asleep, their monitors showing steady vital signs. The wing was empty. She told herself it was probably just a sound from the main hospital, carried by the ventilation system, though it had sounded incredibly close. The cold drafts were another thing. Even with the windows sealed and the heating system on, certain spots in the hallway would suddenly turn icy cold, a stark contrast to the otherwise stuffy air. It wasn't a consistent cold, but rather pockets of frigid air that would appear and disappear without warning. She'd walk through one, feel a shiver run down her spine. Then a few steps later, the air would be back to normal. She checked the vents, the window seals, everything she could think of, but found no logical explanation. The chill felt unnatural, not like a normal draft. It was a cold that seemed to carry a weight, a presence. Sarah, still clinging to her pragmatism, rationalized it as faulty climate control in an old building. She told herself that old buildings always had quirks, drafts, and strange noises. It was just the nature of the beast. But deep down, a tiny seed of unease had been planted. Her logical explanations were starting to feel thin, stretched to cover the growing number of odd occurrences. The quiet of the West Wing was slowly, subtly, beginning to change. It was no longer a comforting silence, but one that felt watchful, waiting. The air itself seemed to hum with an unspoken tension, and Sarah, despite her best efforts, was starting to feel it too. She found herself looking over her shoulder more often, her ears straining to catch sounds that weren't there, or perhaps were. The night shifts were becoming less about routine checks and more about a quiet, persistent vigilance. The quiet vigilance Sarah was forced to adopt soon escalated. One Tuesday night, she walked into the nurse's station to find an old, dusty stack of patient files sitting neatly on her desk. These weren't current files. They were thick, worn folders, their labels faded, clearly from decades ago. She picked one up, blowing off a layer of dust, and saw a date from the 1950s. The names were unfamiliar, the diagnoses archaic. Sarah frowned. She knew these files were kept in a locked storage room in the hospital basement, a place she had never even been. How had they ended up on her desk? And more importantly, who had put them there? She asked the few other night staff she saw, a couple of orderlies and a junior doctor making rounds, but no one had been near her station or seen anything unusual. They just shrugged, used to the quirks of the old hospital. Sarah tried to dismiss it as a prank, maybe a new orderly with a strange sense of humor, but the thought felt hollow even to her. She gathered the files, intending to return them to the basement storage herself the next morning, and locked them away in a supply closet for the rest of her shift. She felt a prickle of unease, a sense that something was deliberately trying to get her attention. The phantom call bells started a few nights later. It was around 3 in the morning, the darkest, quietest part of her shift. Suddenly, the distinct shrill ring of a patient call bell echoed from room 212. Sarah immediately went to check. Room 212 was one of the empty ones, stripped bare of furniture, used only for storage of old equipment. She pushed the door open to find the room dark and silent. There was no patient, no call cord hanging. The bell, however, had clearly rung. She checked the panel at the nurse's station again. The light for 212 was still blinking. She reset it, and moments later, it rang again and again. For nearly an hour, the call bell for room 212 rang intermittently, sometimes several times in a row, sometimes with a few minutes of silence in between. Sarah walked the halls, checking other rooms, listening intently, but it was always 212. When she finally gave up and just let it ring, the sound became a relentless, irritating presence, chipping away at her composure. It only stopped as dawn approached, leaving Sarah with a throbbing headache and a growing sense of dread. Then came the moving equipment. Sarah had a routine of checking the supply rooms and ensuring everything was in its place. One evening, she meticulously organized a cart full of IV stands and placed it against the wall in the main corridor, ready for the morning shift. The next night, she found the cart had been moved. It was now directly in front of the door to room 212, blocking the entrance. It was too heavy for one person to move easily, and certainly not without making a sound. There were no cameras in that section of the wing, and no one else had access to it during her shift. Another time, a gurney that had been stored in a far corner of the wing was found rolled out into the middle of the hallway, its wheels locked. It seemed like whatever was causing these disturbances was becoming bolder, more deliberate. It wasn't just sounds or cold spots anymore. It was physical manipulation of the environment. Sarah started to feel like she was being played with, like an unseen force was trying to provoke a reaction from her. Her pragmatism was fraying at the edges, unable to account for the increasingly bizarre occurrences. The most unsettling discovery, however, happened on a particularly dark and stormy night. Rain lashed against the sealed windows, and the wind howled outside, creating an eerie backdrop to the already tense atmosphere of the West Wing. Sarah was making her rounds, checking the few occupied rooms, when she caught a fleeting glimpse of movement at the far end of the long, dimly lit corridor. It was a small figure, no taller than a child, darting quickly from behind a large, old medical cabinet and disappearing into the shadows of a recessed doorway. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. Her mind, still clinging to logic, immediately tried to rationalize it. A reflection? A trick of the light? But the shape had been too distinct, too human-like. It was wearing what looked like a faded, old-fashioned nightgown. She slowly, cautiously, walked towards where the figure had vanished. The hallway was empty. The recessed doorway led to an old, unused storage closet, its door slightly ajar. Sarah pushed it open further, revealing only dusty shelves and forgotten equipment. There was no one there. But the image of the small figure, the brief flash of something ethereal and childlike, was burned into her mind. It wasn't a shadow, not a reflection. It was a presence. A child. In this abandoned wing, at this hour, it made no sense. Her heart pounded in her chest, a drumbeat of fear replacing the usual quiet rhythm. The rational explanations, the scientific dismissal of the inexplicable, were crumbling around her. This was something else, something she couldn't explain away with faulty wiring or old pipes. This was real, and it was here, in the West Wing, with her. The quiet vigilance had turned into a chilling certainty that she was not alone. The subtle signs had given way to undeniable evidence, leaving Sarah with a profound sense of dread that settled deep in her bones. The child's apparition was a turning point for Sarah. No longer could she dismiss the strange events as mere coincidence or an overactive imagination. The presence was undeniable, and it was growing bolder. The first direct communication came not through words, but through an eerie, almost childish scrawl on a dusty window pane in an unused patient room. Sarah was doing her routine check of the empty rooms when she noticed it. Fingerprints, tiny ones, had traced out a single word. Help. Her heart skipped a beat. She ran a gloved hand over the glass, but the dust remained undisturbed, as if the word had simply appeared. It wasn't a message meant for anyone else. It was clearly intended for her. The next night, the whispers started. They weren't distinct words at first, just a soft, mournful sound, like a child crying far away, echoing through the empty halls. Sometimes it sounded like a name, a faint, almost inaudible Lily. Sarah found herself pausing, straining to hear, her blood running cold with each faint utterance. The entity's communication became more personal, more unnerving. One evening, Sarah was sitting at the nurse's station, filling out some paperwork, when a small, tarnished silver locket appeared on her desk, seemingly out of nowhere. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. It was old, clearly a child's locket. When she managed to pry it open, a faded miniature photograph of a young girl with wide, sad eyes stared back at her. The girl looked strikingly similar to the fleeting figure she had seen in the hallway. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty wing. This was too specific, too direct. It was as if the entity was deliberately trying to connect with her, to show her something personal. Later that same week, she found a small drawing tucked under her coffee mug. It was a crude, childlike depiction of a hospital bed with a stick figure lying in it, and another, smaller stick figure standing beside it, holding a shadowy hand. Underneath, again in childish handwriting, were the words, "Don't leave me." The manifestations then escalated from unsettling to physically threatening. Sarah was walking down a particularly long, deserted corridor when a heavy metal chart rack, which had been standing securely against the wall, suddenly toppled over with a deafening crash, narrowly missing her. She jumped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. There was no one else around, no logical explanation for it. Another time, she was attempting to open a supply closet door when it slammed shut with such force that the old wood splintered. She felt a distinct pressure on her shoulders, as if unseen hands were pushing her away from the door, a cold, unyielding force. She stumbled back, gasping, her mind struggling to process the sudden, violent nature of the attack. It was no longer just about whispers and moving objects. It felt like the entity was trying to physically interact, to prevent her from accessing something, or perhaps to scare her away. One particularly terrifying incident occurred when Sarah was alone in the break room, trying to calm her nerves with a cup of tea. The room was small, with only one entrance. Suddenly, the door slammed shut and locked from the outside. She tried the handle, but it was jammed. A high-pitched, mournful wail filled the air, seeming to come from right outside the door, then faded into a chilling giggle. Sarah pounded on the door, yelling, but there was no one to hear her. Panic began to set in. She was trapped. After what felt like an eternity, the lock clicked open, and the door slowly swung inward. The hallway was empty. The experience left her shaken to her core, the lines between her reality and something else blurring dangerously. Determined to understand what was happening, Sarah began spending her downtime delving into the hospital's archives. She knew there had to be a reason. a history behind the haunting. She searched old patient records, staff logs, anything that might shed light on the West Wing's past. It was a tedious process, sifting through dusty boxes and faded documents, but she was driven by a desperate need for answers. Finally, buried deep within a forgotten folder marked Pediatric Ward, 1950s, she found it. A series of records detailing a small outbreak of a rare, aggressive illness that had swept through the children's ward in the West Wing. Many children had died during that period, but one name kept reappearing: Lily. Lily Peterson, aged 5. Her case file described a prolonged, painful battle against the illness, her parents unable to visit due to strict quarantine protocols. She had died alone in room 212, the very room where Sarah had found the moved IV cot. The locket she found on her desk was described in Lily's personal effects, a gift from her mother. The drawing, too, matched descriptions of Lily's artistic tendencies. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The child figure, the whispers, the plea for help, the personal items. It all clicked into place. Lily, a terrified, lonely child, had died alone in this wing, her spirit trapped, unable to move on. She wasn't malicious. She was just scared and alone, yearning for connection, for someone to acknowledge her. The physical manifestations, the thrown objects, the locked doors, were not acts of aggression, but desperate cries for attention, distorted by the passage of time and the lingering trauma of her solitary death. Sarah felt a profound sadness, a deep empathy for the little girl. This wasn't a monster, it was a child, lost and afraid in the eternal night shift of her own making. The entire dynamic of the haunting shifted from fear to a desperate desire to help. With this new understanding, Sarah knew she couldn't just leave Lily. She couldn't abandon a scared child, even a spectral one, to an eternity of loneliness in the cold, empty wing. Her fear was replaced by a fierce determination to help. She began her desperate measures, delving even deeper into the hospital's history. She spent hours in the archives, meticulously poring over every document, every log, every piece of paper that might offer a clue about Lily's life, her family, anything that could bring closure. She learned that Lily's parents, heartbroken and guilt-ridden, had moved away shortly after her death, unable to bear the memories. There was no living family to contact, no easy way to bring peace through traditional means. Sarah realized that if she was to help Lily, she had to appeal directly to the spirit. She started bringing small, comforting items to room 212 during her shifts. A worn teddy bear, a children's book with colorful illustrations, a small, hand-knitted blanket. She would talk to the empty room, her voice soft and reassuring, telling Lily that she wasn't alone anymore, that someone was there. She explained that she understood Lily was scared, but that it was okay to let go. She played quiet, gentle music on her phone, hoping the melodies would soothe the restless spirit. The whispers didn't stop immediately, but their tone seemed to change. They were less frantic, more like a soft hum, a child's murmur rather than a desperate cry. The physical manifestations also lessened. The slamming doors became soft clicks. The thrown objects merely shifted slightly. It was as if Lily was listening, slowly beginning to trust her. One night, Sarah walked into room 212, the teddy bear clutched in her hand. The air was noticeably colder, and a faint, sweet smell, like old-fashioned candy, filled the room. She knew Lily was present. This was it, the final plea. Sarah sat on the edge of the old, dusty bed, placing the teddy bear carefully beside her. "Lily," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I know you're here. I know you're scared and lonely. But you don't have to be anymore." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Your parents loved you very much. They couldn't be here, but they never forgot you. They wanted you to be happy, to be at peace." She spoke about how much she understood Lily's pain, the fear of being alone, the confusion of being trapped. She told Lily that it was time to move on, to find the light, to be free from the old hospital walls. She spoke of peace, of comfort, of a place where she wouldn't be scared anymore. As Sarah spoke, a faint, shimmering light began to coalesce in the corner of the room. It was not bright or blinding, but soft, almost ethereal. Within the light, Sarah could vaguely discern the outline of a small figure, transparent and shimmering. It was Lily, no longer terrifying, but simply a lost child. The mournful wail, which had become a familiar, chilling sound, now transformed into a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, a sound of profound relief. The light pulsed gently, growing slightly brighter, then slowly, gracefully, it began to drift towards the window. Sarah watched, tears streaming down her face, a mix of sadness and immense relief washing over her. The figure in the light turned, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah felt a sense of gratitude, a silent acknowledgement from the little girl. Then, with a final, gentle shimmer, the light, and Lily within it, passed through the window and vanished into the night sky. The coldness in the room dissipated, replaced by a strange warmth, a quiet calm. The sweet, candy-like scent lingered for a moment longer, then faded completely. The haunting ceased. The West Wing, once a place of dread and unsettling activity, returned to its quiet, abandoned state. No more whispers, no more moving objects, no more phantom call bells. Sarah finished her shift that night, emotionally drained but with an overwhelming sense of closure. She had faced her deepest fears, confronted the unknown, and in doing so, had brought peace to a lost soul. The experience had changed her fundamentally. She couldn't go back to her old life, to her old way of seeing the world. The mundane suddenly seemed less significant, and the unseen far more real and present. A few weeks later, Sarah put in her notice at the hospital. She couldn't stay. Every corner, every shadow, every empty room carried the echoes of her experience. She needed a fresh start, a place where she wouldn't constantly be reminded of the fragile veil between life and death. She left the hospital, not with fear, but with a profound sense of understanding and a new perspective on life and death. The world, for her, was no longer just what she could see and touch. It was a place layered with unseen histories, with lingering emotions, and with spirits waiting for someone to listen. The night shift had revealed more than just the darkness. It had shown her the possibility of redemption, even for the lost souls trapped in the in-between. She carried Lily's story with her, a silent testament to the night she spent bringing peace to a forgotten child. Her journey as a nurse had ended, but her journey into the mysteries of the human spirit had just begun. She knew she would never truly be the same person she was before her shifts in the abandoned hospital wing. The experience had carved a permanent mark on her soul, a reminder of the empathy and courage she found in the face of the unknown. Her nights were no longer filled with the terror of what might be lurking, but with the quiet understanding that sometimes the greatest fear is simply being forgotten. The old hospital was behind her, a place of ghosts and memories. Now, a new chapter began for a man named Frank. He was a retired military veteran, a man who had seen enough of the world's chaos. He sought a quiet life, a job that would keep him busy but not demand too much. The night security guard position at an old, sprawling warehouse seemed perfect. He figured it would be a simple routine. Punch in, walk around, maybe read a book, punch out. No drama, no stress, just peace. His first shift started like any other. The warehouse was massive, a cavernous space filled with towering shelves and countless crates. The air was cold, carrying the faint smell of dust and old wood. The sheer size of the place made sounds echo in strange ways, turning a distant creak into a prolonged groan. Frank, a man of routine and discipline, began his rounds. He checked the loading docks, the main storage areas, the smaller offices tucked away in corners. The isolation was immediate, a heavy blanket that settled over him as soon as the main office staff left for the night. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the hum of ancient machinery and the occasional drip of water somewhere in the vastness. As the hours dragged on, Frank started noticing things. Not big, dramatic things, but subtle shifts that pricked at his military-trained senses. A faint scratching sound, like fingernails on metal, would stop the moment he focused on it. A stack of crates, which he was certain had been perfectly aligned, now seemed slightly askew. He'd pause, squint, and then dismiss it as his eyes playing tricks in the dim light. The feeling of being watched was persistent, a cold sensation on the back of his neck, even when he was alone in the middle of a wide aisle. He'd sweep his flashlight beam across the shelves, seeing nothing but shadows and dust. The security cameras were meant to be his extra set of eyes, his silent partners in patrolling the massive space. But even they seemed to be acting odd. During his first break, Frank sat in the small, cramped guard office, watching the bank of monitors. One camera, pointed at a particularly dark corner of the warehouse, kept glitching. It wasn't a complete blackout, but a flicker of static, a brief scramble of pixels, like a bad signal. He'd tap the screen, check the connections, but it would always clear up on its own, only to glitch again a few minutes later. He made a mental note to report it in the morning, assuming it was just old equipment acting up. He continued his rounds, trying to shake off the growing unease. The warehouse felt different at night, less like a storage facility and more like a sleeping giant, full of unseen potential. He found himself walking faster, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness with more urgency. He was a veteran, not easily scared, but this was a different kind of tension. It wasn't the sound of approaching enemy fire. It was the absence of sound, the unnatural stillness that got to him. One night, he was patrolling near the back loading bay when he heard a distinct thud. It sounded like something heavy falling. He stopped, holding his breath, listening. Nothing. He walked towards the sound, his hand resting on the heavy flashlight at his hip. He found nothing out of place. No fallen boxes, no disturbed pallets. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, almost mocking. Another night, he swore he saw a movement out of the corner of his eye near a stack of old, unused machinery. A quick, dark blur. He spun around, shining his light directly at the spot. Nothing. Just the dusty, silent machines. He told himself it was fatigue, the long hours playing tricks on his mind. But the feeling of being watched intensified, becoming more focused, as if whatever was watching him was drawing closer. He started checking the perimeters more thoroughly, his military training kicking in, looking for any sign of intruders. Yet, there were never any open doors, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. The strangeness was coming from within. He tried to rationalize it all. The echoing sounds, the flickering lights, the feeling of unease, all products of an old building and an overactive imagination. But deep down, a seed of doubt was planted. This wasn't just an old building. It felt like a living, breathing entity. The warehouse had a presence, a heavy, oppressive one that seemed to grow stronger with each passing night. Frank had faced real dangers in his life, but this quiet, unseen threat was starting to chip away at his composure. He found himself double-checking locks that he knew he had secured, peering into shadows with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The quiet job he had sought was turning into something else entirely, something he hadn't signed up for. The warehouse was beginning to reveal its true nature, and Frank was slowly realizing that he was not alone in its vast, echoing halls. The first shift had ended, but the real challenge was just beginning. The quiet job Frank had sought was turning into something else entirely, something he hadn't signed up for. The warehouse was beginning to reveal its true nature, and Frank was slowly realizing that he was not alone in its vast, echoing halls. The first shifts had ended, but the real challenge was just beginning. As the weeks turned into a month, the fleeting glimpses in his peripheral vision became more defined, though never fully clear. He started seeing what he could only describe as shadow figures. They weren't solid, not really. More like distortions in the darkness, movements that didn't quite fit the physics of light and shadow. One night, while he was checking the shipping bay, a dark shape detached itself from a stack of pallets, moving with impossible speed across the floor before vanishing behind a column. He froze, his heart thumping against his ribs. He knew what he'd seen, even if his mind struggled to process it. It was too fast, too fluid, too wrong. He shone his flashlight, sweeping the area, but found nothing. The air in that section felt noticeably colder, a chill that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. These figures started appearing more frequently, always just at the edge of his vision. He'd be walking down an aisle, and a dark blur would dart past a shelf unit ahead. He'd spin around, but it would be gone. It was like they were playing a game with him, testing his limits, making him question his sanity. He began to feel a constant pressure in his head, a dull ache behind his eyes from the strain of trying to catch them, to prove to himself that he wasn't imagining things. He started carrying his heavy-duty maglite like a weapon, ready to swing it at nothing, purely out of instinct. Then the environment itself started to change, as if the warehouse was actively working against him. He found pathways blocked by crates that had been neatly stacked hours before. It wasn't just one or two boxes. Sometimes an entire section would be rearranged, creating a maze where there had been an open aisle. He'd spend precious minutes moving things back into place, grumbling about lazy day shift workers, even though he knew deep down that this wasn't human error. One evening, he was making his rounds when he tried to open a door leading to a storage room. It was locked. He knew he had left it unlocked just 20 minutes earlier. He fumbled for his keys, but then he heard a distinct click from the other side, and the door swung open, revealing an empty, dark space. His breath caught in his throat. No one could have been inside. Alarms started tripping without cause. Not the main perimeter alarms, but internal motion sensors in areas he knew were empty. He'd rush to the control room, watch the red light flash on the map, then check the corresponding camera feed. Static. Always static in that precise area. It was infuriating, a deliberate act of sabotage that left him feeling helpless. He'd report it, of course, but the technicians would always find nothing wrong. "Just old wiring, Frank," they'd say, patting him on the shoulder. He knew better. The most unnerving part, however, was when the entity, or whatever it was, seemed to make a personal connection. Frank had served 2 tours in a combat zone, an experience that had shaped him profoundly. He rarely spoke about it, even to his closest friends. Yet one night, he found a message scratched into the dusty surface of a crate in a remote corner of the warehouse. It wasn't a random scribble. It was a series of numbers, a date. The date of a particularly difficult mission, one where he had almost lost his life and had lost comrades. He stared at it, his blood running cold. How could anyone know that? No one at the warehouse knew about his military past in such detail. He tried to wipe it away, but the message was etched deep, as if burned into the wood. The next night, he found another message, this time a single word scrawled on a dusty workbench. Failure. It hit him hard. That word, that feeling, had haunted him since his service. He felt a profound sense of violation, as if his deepest, most guarded fears were being exposed and used against him. This wasn't just a random haunting. This was personal. The warehouse, once a place of quiet solitude, had become a hunting ground. Frank felt like prey. Every shadow seemed to hold a lurking threat. Every creak of the old building was a potential warning. He constantly looked over his shoulder, his senses hyper-alert, his military training now repurposed for an enemy he couldn't see or fight in a conventional way. The vast, echoing halls, once just empty spaces, now felt like a labyrinth designed to trap him, to wear him down. He started bringing a thermos of strong coffee, not for warmth, but to keep himself awake, to fight off the fatigue that he knew would make him vulnerable. The quiet job was no longer quiet. It was a nightly battle for his peace of mind, and perhaps for something more. He knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. The growing threat was becoming unbearable. The quiet job was no longer quiet. It was a nightly battle for his peace of mind, and perhaps for something more. He knew he couldn't keep this up much longer. The growing threat was becoming unbearable. One night, the feeling of being watched intensified to an almost physical pressure. Frank was doing his rounds on the upper level, his flashlight beam cutting through the shadows when he heard a distinct thud from below. It wasn't the usual creak of the old building. This was heavy, intentional. He froze, listening. Another thud, closer this time, followed by a scraping sound, like something large being dragged across the concrete floor. He gripped his flashlight tighter, his heart pounding a rhythm against his ribs he hadn't felt since his time overseas. He moved slowly, carefully, towards the edge of the catwalk, peering down into the cavernous space below. The air grew heavy, thick with a cold, metallic scent he couldn't place. And then he saw it. Not a fleeting shadow this time, but something more substantial. It was tall, unnaturally thin, with limbs that seemed to bend at odd angles. It moved with a jerky, disjointed motion, almost like a puppet on broken strings, dragging what looked like a large, heavy tarp across the floor. Frank's military training kicked in. He didn't scream, didn't run. He ducked back, out of sight, his mind racing. This wasn't just a ghost playing tricks. This was something tangible, something that could interact with the physical world. He felt a primal fear, but also a surge of adrenaline. He was no longer just a security guard. He was a soldier again, facing an enemy. He drew the heavy-duty maglite from his belt, holding it like a weapon. He had to know what it was doing. He crept along the catwalk, staying in the shadows, until he reached a spot directly above the entity. He shone his flashlight down. The light hit the figure, and it stopped, slowly turning its head towards him. It didn't have a face, not in the way a human does. Just a dark, indistinct mass where a head should be, but with 2 points that seemed to absorb the light, like bottomless pits. The tarp it was dragging was now still. He could see a shape beneath it, a human-sized lump. A guttural sound, like stones grinding together, emanated from the figure. It wasn't a voice, but it was communication, a warning. Frank felt a cold dread wash over him, but he stood his ground. This was it, the direct encounter he had been dreading, yet in a strange way had been preparing for. The creature took a step towards the catwalk support beam, its movements still disjointed, but with an unsettling speed. Frank knew he couldn't stay up there. He had to move. He turned and ran, not blindly, but with purpose, heading for the nearest emergency exit. The creature below let out another grinding sound, and Frank heard a clang as something heavy hit the metal catwalk behind him. He didn't look back. He just ran, his heavy boots pounding on the metal grating. He reached the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could hear it behind him, not running, but moving with a slow, deliberate pace that was somehow more terrifying than a chase. As he reached the ground floor, he remembered the messages, the personal attacks. This thing knew him, knew his past. He had to use that against it. He veered off course, away from the exit, heading instead towards the oldest, most forgotten section of the warehouse, the section filled with old, decaying archives and rusted machinery. He knew this area well from his initial patrols, a place where dust lay thick and forgotten histories lingered. He burst into the archive section, the musty smell of old paper filling his nostrils. He knew there was a small, almost hidden office in this section, used by a former warehouse manager decades ago. He remembered seeing old records there. He quickly found the office, pushing open the creaking door. Inside, scattered on a desk beneath a thick layer of dust, were old ledgers and yellowed newspaper clippings. He grabbed a handful of papers, his eyes scanning them frantically. He was looking for a pattern, a name, anything that could explain this. His flashlight beam fell upon a faded newspaper article. Warehouse fire claims 5 lives. Arson suspected. The date was from over 50 years ago. He quickly read through it, his eyes darting across the page. A group of disgruntled former employees, laid off without severance, had set the fire as an act of revenge. 5 people, mostly night shift workers, had been trapped inside, unable to escape the inferno. Their bodies were never fully recovered. The warehouse had been rebuilt, but the memory, the tragedy, had lingered. He looked up, and there it was, standing in the doorway of the small office, its dark, faceless head tilted. It wasn't moving towards him now. It was just watching. He realized then what it wanted. It wasn't anger, it was sorrow, a desperate need for acknowledgement. The failure message, the date, it wasn't about him, not really. It was about the failure of the company, the failure of justice. The top, he had seen it dragging, the human-sized lump beneath it. It was trying to show him what had happened, to reenact the tragedy. Frank held up the newspaper clipping. "I know," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. "I know what happened here. I know about the fire. I know about the people." He pointed to the article, to the names listed. "I see them. I see you." A strange, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the entity. The oppressive cold in the room lessened slightly. It was as if a heavy weight had been lifted. He didn't understand how, but he knew he had connected with it, acknowledged its pain. He had given it what it had been seeking for decades: recognition. He slowly backed out of the office, keeping his eyes on the entity. It didn't follow. It simply stood there, a silent sentinel in the doorway of the past. Frank didn't wait. He didn't need to. He knew the haunting was over, or at least that its focus had shifted. He turned and ran, not from fear this time, but towards the exit, towards the dawn. He burst out of the warehouse doors, gulping in the fresh, cold morning air. He never looked back. He never returned to that warehouse. The job was done. The memory of the faceless figure and the tragic fire remained, a stark reminder of the unseen world and the histories that refuse to stay buried. The security guard's harrowing escape marked the end of his ordeal, but in another part of the city, at a venerable old university, a different kind of night shift was just beginning. Eleanor, a meticulous and introverted librarian, found her solace among the towering shelves and hushed aisles of the university's ancient archives. Her days were spent cataloging, preserving, and sometimes simply admiring the brittle pages of history. But her night shifts were reserved for the rarely accessed deepest recesses of the archive, a place known as the Special Collections Vault. This was where manuscripts too old to be touched by casual hands and books too fragile for everyday display resided. The air in the vault was always cool, regulated to protect the delicate paper, and carried the faint, comforting scent of aged parchment and leather. Eleanor loved these quiet hours. The oppressive silence of the vault, broken only by the soft rustle of pages or the gentle hum of the climate control system, was her sanctuary. She felt a profound connection to the past, a sense of being a guardian of forgotten stories. Her task for the next few months was to recatalog a newly acquired private collection of 17th century texts, a monumental undertaking that required intense focus and undisturbed concentration. She would often work until the first rays of dawn painted the stained glass windows of the main library hall, then quietly slip away, leaving the archives to the bustling daytime staff. From her very first night in the Special Collections Vault, Eleanor noticed subtle disturbances. At first, she dismissed them as products of her imagination or the natural settling of an old building. She'd find books slightly ajar, not fully pushed back into their slots, even though she distinctly remembered shelving them correctly. Sometimes she'd discover a bookmark she hadn't placed, a thin strip of faded silk marking a page in a volume she hadn't yet touched. She'd meticulously reshelve the book, straighten the bookmark, and continue her work, a tiny frown creasing her brow. Then there was the faint scent. Not the usual aroma of old paper, but something distinct and delicate, like a very old, almost completely evaporated perfume. It was fleeting, appearing only in specific sections of the vault, particularly around the oldest Latin manuscripts. Eleanor, a woman of logic and order, tried to rationalize it. Perhaps a visitor during the day had worn perfume, and the scent had lingered in the still air. But the scent was too consistent, too localized, and always seemed to dissipate as quickly as it appeared, leaving her with a vague sense of unease. The feeling of being watched was the most persistent and unsettling of these initial anomalies. It wasn't a malicious or threatening presence, but rather a cold, watchful gaze. She would be deeply engrossed in a text, her magnifying glass hovering over intricate script when a shiver would run down her spine and the air around her would grow noticeably colder. She'd glance up, scanning the towering shelves, the narrow aisles, the dimly lit corners. Nothing. Just the endless rows of books, silent witnesses to centuries of human thought. One night, while working on a particularly dense theological text, Eleanor felt the familiar cold sensation wash over her. She paused, her hand hovering over a brittle page, and slowly raised her head. Her eyes swept across the aisle. This time, the feeling was stronger, more focused, as if someone were standing directly behind her, looking over her shoulder. She turned slowly, hesitantly, her heart giving a quiet thump against her ribs. The aisle was empty, of course, always empty. But as her gaze fell upon a section of shelves dedicated to ancient poetry, she noticed something peculiar. A single book, a beautifully bound collection of medieval sonnets, was not quite sitting right on its shelf. It was pushed forward ever so slightly, as if someone had just pulled it out and then hastily returned it. Eleanor walked over, her footsteps echoing softly in the cavernous space. She reached out, her fingers brushing the spine of the book. It felt cool to the touch, colder than the surrounding volumes. As she gently pushed it back into place, a page inside the book seemed to flutter, catching her attention. She opened it to the marked page, a poem about lost love and eternal longing. A thin, almost transparent silk bookmark lay within its pages, the same faded silk she had seen before. Eleanor wasn't a superstitious woman. Her life was built on facts, on documented history, on the tangible evidence found in the books she so carefully tended. Yet, a tiny seed of doubt began to sprout in her logical mind. These weren't random occurrences anymore. They were too specific, too localized. It was as if something or someone was trying to get her attention, gently, subtly. The watchful presence was no longer just a feeling. It was becoming a silent companion in her nightly vigil, an unseen entity moving through the labyrinthine shelves, always just out of sight, always just beyond her logical grasp. The archives, once her sanctuary, were slowly transforming into something more. They were becoming a stage, and she, Eleanor, was the sole audience to a silent, ancient play. The silk bookmark, appearing in different books each night, became the entity's primary method of communication. Eleanor, initially skeptical, began to recognize a pattern. The books chosen were rarely random. They were often tied to themes of loss, longing, unfulfilled dreams, or forgotten histories. One night, she found the bookmark in a collection of letters written by a prominent local historian from the late 1800s. The letter it marked spoke of a beloved daughter, a brilliant young woman who had dedicated her life to the archives, only to die tragically young, her work unfinished. This discovery sparked something in Eleanor. Her meticulous research skills, usually applied to academic pursuits, now focused on the history of the archives themselves. She spent her breaks digging through old personnel records, death certificates, and local newspaper archives. The name that kept reappearing, the one consistently linked to the tragic story, was Clara. Clara, a bright, passionate archivist, had died in a fire that had consumed a small section of the archives over a century ago. The fire was deemed accidental, but whispers of a broken heart and a secret love affair had persisted among the staff for decades. Clara's greatest sorrow, according to the letters, was leaving her life's work incomplete, a vast cataloging project of the oldest European texts. The entity's messages grew more direct. Books would fall from shelves, landing open on specific pages. Sometimes a single word, picked from a sentence, would be underlined by an invisible finger, forming a fragmented plea or a mournful statement. Eleanor began to understand. Clara wasn't malevolent. She was simply stuck, her spirit tethered to the place where her life's purpose had been abruptly cut short. She yearned for completion, for her work to be seen, acknowledged. One particularly quiet night, as the grandfather clock in the main hall chimed 3 times, Eleanor found herself in the section Clara had been working on before her death. It was a vast collection of medieval illuminated manuscripts, still largely uncatalogued, just as Clara had left them. A wave of profound sadness washed over her, a feeling so strong it wasn't her own. She felt Clara's presence more intensely than ever before, a deep, silent sorrow radiating from the ancient texts. Eleanor sat at a large oak table, surrounded by the delicate, centuries-old volumes. She pulled out a blank cataloging card, her pen poised. "Clara," she whispered into the silence, her voice soft but firm. "I understand. I see your work. I will finish it." A faint, almost imperceptible sigh seemed to drift through the air, carrying with it the scent of old roses and parchment. The cold spot around her lessened, replaced by a gentle warmth. Eleanor began to work, systematically cataloging the manuscripts, just as Clara would have done. She spoke to Clara, narrating her actions, describing the texts, acknowledging the beauty and history that Clara had so loved. She felt a profound connection, a shared purpose spanning generations. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Eleanor dedicated every night shift to Clara's unfinished project. The subtle disturbances ceased. The misplaced books, the flickering lights, the cold presence, all gone. Only the lingering scent of old roses, now a comforting aroma, remained. It was as if Clara was watching, not with longing, but with quiet contentment. One morning, as the first rays of dawn pierced the stained glass windows of the archives, Eleanor placed the final cataloging card into its drawer. She leaned back, exhausted but fulfilled. The section was complete. Clara's work was done. A profound sense of peace settled over the archives, a peace that had been absent for over a century. As Eleanor gathered her things, a single, perfectly preserved rose petal, the color of dried blood, floated down from the towering shelves and landed softly on her open hand. It was a silent, beautiful farewell. She knew, without a doubt, that Clara had finally found her rest. Eleanor remained at the archives, but her night shifts were different now. The heavy solitude had been replaced by a quiet reverence. She still felt a presence, but it was no longer a restless spirit. It was a guardian, a silent testament to a life dedicated to knowledge and beauty. The experience had changed her. The meticulous librarian, who once only believed in the tangible, now carried a profound understanding of the unseen world, a world where stories, once unfinished, could find their resolution, and where even the most meticulous of minds could find connection in the most unexpected places. She understood that sometimes the greatest treasures in the archives weren't just the books themselves, but the silent stories woven into their very fabric, waiting patiently for someone to finally read them. And Eleanor, the quiet archivist, had become that reader, forever connecting with the past she had helped bring to peace.